Yes. Historians again, one was like Herodotus, who falls back upon poetry for his style of writing, for the manner of narrating tales, and now he says he even gives the titles of nine muses to his books. The next is followed by passions. When they are describing one emotions of characters in history, they again take to poetry. The many particularities of battles which no man could affirm. So you cannot affirm how actually the battles took place in the past. Recording those peculiarities, the details about a battle, about how a hero fared in the war. So those warfaring heroes, the description of each and all comes from what historians have heard about. So they are again telltales. So you cannot validate these stories that come from the word of mouth, but then again you tend to give it a truth value because it's now being written by a historian like Herodotus. Or if that be denied me, or if you disagree with me on these points, says Philip Sidney, this me is Philip Sidney, or if you deny or disagree with me on these points, then the long orations put in the mouths of great kings and captains by historians, which it is certain they never pronounced. Now, historians have also been doing this, that in order to capture the real the real history that went before the present, he tells you about what the kings and captains might have said to their followers, and that again is not certain that these were the actual words pronounced by them, because there are no records. But Herodotus and the historians like him do put these words into the mouths of the kings and captains, and that again, that narration, that speech that historians give to these kings is again an acquired talent or style from poets. Now I take you to the page. This one is Wikipedia page on histories that he has written. Now the first book of histories he titles is Clio. I'll move to the third point. In this text, he tells you of how Candalus made his bodyguard Gyges view the naked body of his wife. Upon discovery, she ordered Gyges to murder Candalus or face death himself. How Gyges took the kingdom from Candalus. Now, these are basically more of telltales than actual history, which could not be affirmed, re-examined as we do it nowadays in historical studies. And I want you to go to first the titles. Now book 2 is titled Euterpe, 3 is Thalia, Melpomene, then Terpsichore, Erato, Polymnia, Urania, Calliope are the 9 books named by 9 muses. Now style. Look at this portion. In his introduction to Hicetus' work Genealogies, Hicetus the Milesian speaks thus. Hicetus the Milesian speaks thus. Now these are the words put in the mouth of Milesian. Hicetus. He doesn't actually know what Hicetus might have pronounced at that time, but these are the words that he is putting into his mouth. I write these things as they seem true to me, for the stories told by the Greeks are various and, in my opinion, absurd. This is Hicetus saying this, but this is actually Herodotus saying it. So he gives his words, puts them into the mouth of a historical character like Hicetus. Now that again is something imaginary and unreal. This points forward to the folksy yet international outlook typical of Herodotus. Folksy, based on folks. Back to the text. Now this example was of a historian, how he also makes use of something written by poets. So that truly neither philosopher nor historiographer could at the first have entered into the gates of popular judgments if they had not taken a great passport of poetry, which in all nations in this day where learning flourishes not, is plain to be seen. Now he compares this passport taking of poetry, which people of learning, means the day where science and technology are being prioritized over arts. In these parts of the world, poetry is being neglected, but still in areas where learning has not flourished yet, science and technology has not gained an upper hand, you can see this falling back upon poetry, or poetry being an essential part of life, is plainly to be seen in areas where science and technology has not gained an upper hand yet, in all which they have some feeling of poetry. In these lands, they do still have some feeling of poetry. In Turkey, besides their law-giving divines, they have no other writers but poets. In our neighbor country Ireland, where truly learning goes very bare, yet are their poets held in a devout reverence. Even among the most barbarous and simple Indians, where no writing is, yet have they their poets, who make and sing songs which they call aretos. Both of their ancestors' deeds and praises of their gods, a sufficient probability that if ever learning come among them, it must be by having their hard, dull wits softened and sharpened with the sweet delights of poetry. For until they find a pleasure in the exercise of the mind, great promises of much knowledge will little persuade them that know not the fruits of knowledge. Now these lines can be used for post-colonial analysis of the language of Sidney. This is very a colonial language that he makes use of. First he calls Indians barbarous and simple Indians who have no writing, which is again a false impression of the Orientalists, that not the Orientalists, sorry, the Occidents, who believed that Indians had no writing, when actually writing belonged to Indians much before English as a writing came to the English. Then the other point is, if learning ever came among them, their hard, dull wits will be softened and sharpened, but with delights of poetry. Now this comes from the songs, the bhajans the Hindus have been playing and singing, and that was the only impression foreigners would have of Indians. So he believes that if ever knowledge would go to India, if ever learning will ever flourish in India, they will require all the learning to be sung to them, because their dull wits will not be softened or sharpened without music. This is again a colonial take on Indians. For until they find a pleasure in the exercise of the mind, great promises of much knowledge will little persuade them that know not the fruits of knowledge. In Wales, the true remnant of the ancient Britons, as there are good authorities to show the long time they had poets, which they called bards. So through all the conquests of Romans, the Saxons, Danes and Normans, some of whom did seek to ruin all memory of learning from among them, yet do their poets even to this day last, so as it is not more notable in soon beginning than in long continuing. So now this part, he gives you brief details about how Turkey still relies upon the poets for their writing. Even if it's legal writing, they require poets for it, somebody who is good, has a good hold on language and literature. Then again he gives you the example of Indians, who again still rely upon poetry more than the other scientific knowledge, and even if scientific knowledge comes to them, they may require it in music, in rhythm and poetry. Then third one, he comes back to his own land and tells you how Britons have earlier been have had really good poets who were called bards, and then with the conquests of the Romans, the Saxons, the Danes, the Normans, this is sequential conquest, first to the Romans followed by Saxons, Danes and Normans. how they tended to ruin the memory of learning from among them. How was this done? I have told you. Memory of learning came more from Romans, and then it was ruined by Saxons and Danes, and then regained by Normans. This has already been dealt with because Saxons and Danes were warrior communities, unlike Romans. And Normans also had a good tendency towards learning and development, unlike Saxons and Danes. And then yet do their poets even to this day last. But the poets that they had during the Romans continued to live during the times of Saxons and then live to this day, like him, like many other people that Puritans like Stephen Coulson do not like. So it's not more notable in soon beginning than in long continuing. So this the influence of poetry in Britain, the influence of poetry in this island has not been more notable during its beginning, but you can see the tradition has been there and how it has continued for so long. They have a heritage, they have a legacy of poetry. But since the authors of most of our sciences were the Romans and before them the Greeks, let us a little stand upon their authorities. But even so far as to see what names they have given unto this now scorned skill. So this will be followed by the people who were Romans, who were Greeks, who are now belittling poets and poetry, but this hasn't been the case in history. Now this is about the history of those people who are now giving much more importance to scientific knowledge. Among the Romans, a poet was called Vates, which is as much a diviner, foreseer, a prophet, as by his conjoined words vaticinium and vaticinary is manifest. He gives you these Roman words. A poet in Roman was called Vates. This is something that you must have already paid attention to when you have done this in your classes. This is what mostly teachers pay attention to. So this very paragraph doesn't need much of a critical close read because you have done this. Vates was considered to be a diviner, a foreseer, or a prophet, and then the manifestation in its other forms, in its other phonemic forms like vaticinium and vaticinary, is also associated to a diviner and a prophet. So heavenly a title did that excellent people bestow upon this heart-ravishing knowledge. This was at that time considered such a heart-ravishing knowledge that close to a prophet was the name given to a poet. And so far were they carried into the admiration thereof that they thought in the chanceable hitting upon any such verses great foretokens of their following fortunes were placed, whereupon grew the word of sortes Virgilini. When by sudden opening Virgil's book they lighted upon some verses of his making, whereof the histories of the emperors' lives are full, as of Albinus the governor of our island, who in his childhood met with this verse: Arma amens capio, nexat rationis in armis. Angered I take up arms, but reason does not lie in arms. And in his age performed it, although it were a very vain and godless superstition, as also it was to think that spirits were commanded by such verses, whereupon this word charms derived the carmina comes. So yet serves it to show the great reverence those wits were held in, and altogether not without ground, since both the oracles of Delphos and Sibylla's prophecies were wholly delivered in verses. For that same exquisite observing of number and measure in words, and that high flying liberty of conceit proper to the poet, did seem to have some divine force in it. Anybody who would like to summarize this part? I told you have done this in class because I know these are the parts that are paid much attention to in classes. So summarize what goes on in here. from the name of Veds? Seema, Maruk, Samya, Anika. Come on. Anika? Among the Romans, a poet was called Vates, which is as much a diviner, foreseer, or a prophet as by his conjoined words, vaticinium and vaticinari. This also reminds you of Vatican City. Vaticinium and vaticinari, both vaticinium is the noun form. It means a prophecy. It means something that is foretold, and vaticinari is the verbal form of it, form of it, which means to foretell, to foresee something, to prophesy something. And Vates was a name very close to that of these two in among the Romans. So this connection is very manifest. It's overt. You can very clearly see the connection between the words. So heavenly a title did that excellent people bestow upon this heart-ravishing knowledge. So this knowledge is different from scientific knowledge. This is how this fight continues to this day of arts and science. Which is better of the two? So he calls this heart-ravishing knowledge how Romans in that time did acknowledge the importance of poetry, and so far were they carried into the admiration thereof, and they did the admiration of this kind of knowledge to the extent that they thought in the chanceable hitting upon any such verses great foretokens of their following fortunes were placed. They give verses such importance, verses were given such importance that they believed if you were able to hit upon certain verses correctly, sing them properly, you can move heavens. Fortunes are placed inside the verses. You can move heavens. That prophecies will actually come true if you can properly place these verses. Fortunes are placed inside them. Whereupon grew the word of sortes Virgilianae, when by sudden opening Virgil's book they lighted upon some verses of his making. He gives you an example in this part. He gives you an example from Virgil's book. Do you know Virgil? Have you heard of Virgil?
Yes,
What is it? Which book has he written? Huh?
Aeneas.
Aeneid. Yeah, Aeneid. Aeneas is the hero of the book. Virgil's Aeneid. Now, Aeneid tells you how these people run away from the war, the Trojan War, and after that how they establish themselves in a new land. But here again he puts emphasis on the connection between Vates, Vaticinium, and now Sortis Virgilianae. Sortis again is associated with divinity. So this text, whatever Virgil wrote, and some portions of Virgil's Aeneid are considered to be authoritative as the like of Bible. It's like gospel for them. That Virgil himself was given the title Sortis Virgilianae. When by sudden opening Virgil's book they lighted upon some verse of his making, means of his creation, whereof The histories of the emperors' lives are full. Virgil's Aeneid is full of the stories about the history of how certain emperors lived before. Like the one that he tells at the beginning is about Aeneas, how Aeneas is able to run away from after the fall of Trojan. He is the survivor, he is the only survivor of that dynasty. And he is able to survive and establish in a different land and start again his rule. It begins with the childhood, almost the childhood of these emperors, and how they eventually become emperors of great lands. It's full of their lives. As of Albinus, the governor of our island, who in his childhood met with this verse. Now he talks about one of the governors in history, a Roman himself, but he became the governor of Britain. This is about when Romans had conquered England. He came across this verse. Ame emens capio nexat rationis in armis. Angered, I take up arms, but reason does not lie in arms. Arms are ammunitions, the fight that they used to have, the battles of these warriors. Angered, I am angered, and therefore I take up arms, I fight. But reason does not lie in arms, it does not lie in violence. Reason is not in violence. This line is not from Bible, but it has become a gospel. It has become a gospel now. And in his age, he performed it. This is about Albinus. Although it were a very vain and godless superstition, godless because this has been taken from Virgil and not from Bible, but it became a superstition, and as also it was to think that spirits were commanded by such verses. So by saying this, it was believed that gods will give you power and you will be able to be successful in a war that you are going to fight. Angered, I take up arms, but reason does not lie in arms. So they are saying this to God, and this is how they would believe that God will come to their rescue. And he calls it godless superstition, because Romans at this time, Albinus is not a pagan, he is a Christian. And these lines were spoken actually by pagans during war. Although it were a very vain and godless superstition, as also it was to think that spirits were commanded by such verses, whereupon this word charms, derived of Carmina comes, so yet serves it to show the great reverence those wits were held in. Which wits is he talking about?
University.
God, no. Read the sentence. Why would you talk about university wits? Show great reverence those wits were held in. The wits of the poets, like that of Virgil here. Whereupon this word charms derived of Carmina. Carmina is a Hebrew word which means a garden. This is derived the charms he is speaking about. Whereupon this word charms derived of Carmina comes, so yet serves it to show the great reverence those wits were held in, and altogether not without ground, since both the oracles of Delphos and Sibylla's prophecies were wholly delivered in verses. Now he connects the verses that were used by pagans for certain prophecies, and then even Christians believed in them. The charms that they carried, the charms these verses carried. The word again used for it is